Yesterday afternoon at Guru Prem, Asha gave a satsang and talked about Swami. It was very, very inspiring. Swami never liked us to talk about him. I remember every year it came to be May 19th, his birthday, and we always had an event. And Swami would come, it was always on a weekend, at least we celebrated it on a weekend. And Swami would come to speak on Saturday afternoon and Sunday morning, but Saturday morning we always got together and talked publicly about Swami, about his accomplishments, about his discipleship, about his creativity, and he never liked that. I remember so clearly he would say, like on Thursday, "Well, what's happening this weekend?" And we would say, "Oh, sir, it's your birthday. Well, what are we going to do?" And we'll say, "Well, sir, we hope very much you're going to speak." "Well, what's happening on Saturday morning?" There was the pause because we knew. "Well, Swami, we thought we'd talk about your life." "Why?" He would say, "I can talk about my life." And we would say to him, "Swami, but you don't." And it was true because he didn't speak about himself. On his birthday, he talked about Master and about his relationship with him and his time with him. And so it really was up to us to talk about Swamiji. And I would like to do that this morning. I think that more than ever now, that Swami has an infinite and no longer a human body, it really is up to us to talk about him not as personality, not as an individual, but for the disciple that he was and for the desire that he had. He often said, as Master did, "I desire to know God and to share him with everyone." And he had another wish. He said, "I want to carry on my Guru's work in the way that he would carry it on, in that spirit, with that freedom, with that energy, with that creativity, with that unconventional nature, always adapting to new situations, always being ahead of the times, always lifting people to higher awareness and higher consciousness." He never wanted Master to be relegated to a museum. And so he dedicated his life to that, to carrying on every part of what Master had started. Well, we might ask ourselves, why didn't Yogananda finish what he started? I used to think about that. He's a master. He came, he could do anything. He had the power to move mountains. So why didn't he develop completely cooperative communities? Why didn't he establish a new outlook on education for children? Why didn't he? And so forth. And what I came to realize is that a great master comes to set into motion energies in new directions. There are certain masters who come at the beginning of a yuga, and Yogananda was the Dwapara Yuga avatar. Not that there won't be others. Dwapara Yuga is going to last for another 2,300 years. 2,200 years, and so there will be others. But Yogananda came on the cusp of the full Dwapara Yuga. He was born almost exactly at the beginning. Dwapara Yuga began fully after the Shandhya in 1899, and Yogananda was born in 1893. And so he was born to bring in the Dwapara way of living, of thinking, of understanding, of acting, which is so much different than the Kali Yuga ways. In Kali Yuga, everything needed to be cut and dry, to fit into certain forms and formats and boxes. And there's a lot of that still around, isn't there? Whenever we go to a government office and all of the papers we need to fill out and the forms, and you go to a bank, and I mean, how many times have you had to sign your name on documents just to complete one operation? And it goes on, and offices filled with books and papers and so forth. But Dwapara Yuga is free-flowing. It's formless. I remember one time we were with Swami, and he was invited, as he often was, to a conference of spiritual leaders, and this was in Canada. So up we went to accompany him and to sing and to carry the books and sell the books and do all the things we did to support Swami. And in this particular conference, Swami was to speak on spiritual communities. And he was introduced, quite rightly so, as the father of the spiritual community movement, the cooperative community movement. He had written some years ago, before then, the book, Cooperative Communities, How to Start Them and Why. So the person who was the MC made this elaborate introduction of Swami and all about his great accomplishments in starting the movement of cooperative communities. So Swami stands up to the microphone, and the first thing he says is, "Thank you very much for your kind introduction, but I must say honestly that I really don't care at all about cooperative communities." And there was, like this universal gasp. I mean, there was 1,000 or 2,000 people, and everybody went like that. Like, oh my gosh, did they invite the wrong person? Has he gone crazy? He said, it's not communities I care about, it's people I care about. And communities, if they serve people in their spiritual growth, if they serve people in their evolution, if they help us to become better human beings, more kind, more respectful, closer to God, then yes, I'm all in favor of cooperative communities. And yes, I have founded one, and I think, as Master did, they will spread across the face of the earth in this early part of Dwapara Yuga. But always remember, he said, it's not the form that's important. It's the content, not the container. And he said during that conference, if in the future cooperative communities no longer serve the human spirit and its development, I hope they'll be extinguished. He had such deep understanding of what Master's vision was, of what God's will is, and that form doesn't really matter. So often during all of the years of Ananda's development, he has helped us to remember this lesson. A very good friend of mine who was together with me in the monastery, the first monastery at Ananda, back in the early 1970s. She had been in the monastery a while, and she began to think that perhaps it might be appropriate for her to continue her spiritual growth in a relationship and get married. But she was very conflicted. She really didn't know what to do. And so one day she went to Swami and asked him, Swami, should I get married or should I stay in the convent, in the monastery? And he answered her very simply, it doesn't matter. And in the beginning, when he said that, she didn't understand. I mean, how could it not matter? She was, all in turmoil inside of herself. She'd been thinking about this for months, and it had really been disturbing her meditations, and she was thinking it was the biggest decision in her life, and that everything was going to depend on it. And here's Swami saying to her, it doesn't matter. Because all that really matters is that we love God, that we dedicate ourselves to Him and our lives to Him, and the form in which we live, whether it's in a community near one or outside of a community, whether it's with a husband or family or as a sadhu or a sadhaka, it doesn't matter. It's not the container, it's what we put into the container. Well, this morning, the first thing, I'm just going to move this. Didn't want to be half on the carpet and half off. This morning, I'd like to tell you, from my perspective, as someone who came to Swamiji at the very beginning of Ananda in 1969, how I did see how I lived through different phases of his life. Now, I'm sure that Swami would say, my life didn't have phases. You know, I'm not like a painter. I had my blue period and my yellow period, you know. It was just life. It was all about serving God and Guru. But I have the kind of mind that still likes to put things a little bit in boxes. And as I was recently reflecting on my life with Swami, I came to see that there were distinct moments in his life relative to the development of the community. I won't speak about it before 1969 because I didn't know him then, and we have his autobiography that tells us about those early years. But again, you know, Swami didn't write about himself. He wrote about others. He wrote about Master. In 1969, and for those early years up until 1976, and I'll tell you in a minute why I've chosen that date, this was the first phase of my relationship with Swami. And at that time, I was quite young. When I came to Ananda and to Swami, I was 24 years old, and I had been in school for 22 of those 24 years. And I was tired of being in school, and I was looking for something else to do with my life. Now, I, like many of the people who came to Ananda in the very first year, in the very first years, we really didn't know anything about spirituality. That isn't why we were there. I didn't know anything about Yogananda. I had not read the autobiography of a yogi, although serendipitously, I had the autobiography of a yogi in my backpack when I arrived. The only book I had with me on my big adventure in life, and I had no idea why I had that book with me, and I didn't even know that Ananda had anything to do with Yogananda, even though I had studied with Swami Kriyananda for the 6 previous months. I had studied yoga with him. And during those months of the classes, he told us that he had recently purchased a beautiful piece of property in the mountains in the forest, and he was looking for people to come and help him build the community. Well, not having anything else to do at that moment in my life, and being very interested in community living, I decided to go. And so I arrived with a backpack and a sleeping bag and I think $100 in my pocket, and that was all. We call it footloose and fancy-free. And I had no plans. For the first time in my life, I had no plans, because as a student, I was always planning. So I had planned to visit this nascent community that really was, at the very beginning, there was almost nothing there. There was so nothing there that my place when I arrived was sleeping under a tree. And there was no place to sleep. I said, well, what should I do? And the retreat master said, well, you have a sleeping bag, don't you? I said, yes. He said, pick a tree. There's a lot of trees, no houses, no guest rooms, but there's the whole forest. So, city girl, I just went out and I gathered pine needles together, made a mattress out of it, and put my sleeping bag down, and there it was. And Swami Kriyananda, at that moment in time, it was in June, he was still teaching his classes in the San Francisco area. And about maybe a week after I arrived, he arrived. And the day that he arrived, I was walking by the temple and he was walking by, and he stopped me and he said, hello, who are you? And I told him my name. And he said, why have you come? And I said, oh, I was in your yoga class in January, and I answered the call. And he said, well, how long do you plan to stay? I said, well, I think about 2 weeks, because I'm going to hitchhike across the country. I'm thinking of going into Canada all the way across and so forth. He said, let me see your hand. I said, excuse me? He said, let me see your hand. And so I put out my right hand, and he took it, and he looked at it for a while, and he looked up at me, and he said, I don't think you're going anywhere. I think you're going to spend the rest of your life here. Well, this was very shocking to me. And by the way, Swami was not a palm reader, and I don't think he read other people's hands, at least not regularly. And so this was like a one of a kind, but I didn't know it then. And I thought, gosh, what a really strange person this is. And the rest, you tell a person who's a young person, energetic, who's 24 years old, the rest of your life, that's a long time. So I wasn't keen on it. I didn't say, I think I responded by saying, well, I only have a reservation here for 2 weeks. And he just, that little tiny little smile, he said, well, we'll see. So there were many who came during that period. Only a few of them had studied with Swami beforehand. Jyotish was one of those people. Jaya, Nayaswami Jaya, was also in Swami's classes during that time. So they are two of 4 people who came, let's say, with Swami. The rest of us just arrived for one reason or another. And in the first phase of Swami's life, or you could say my life with Swami, was the phase that I call the teaching phase, because he had to teach us everything about the spiritual path. I mean, he was the one who had known Yogananda. He was the one who knew the teachings. And we really, even though we thought we knew everything, we really didn't know anything at all. He was enormously patient, but he was always present with us during those years. He was the only teacher. He gave Sunday Satsang every Sunday. He led the yoga postures. He gave classes during the week. At the end of summer, he started a tradition called Spiritual Renewal Week, in which he taught every morning class from Monday through Friday. He provided the entertainment every evening, singing and telling stories of Master and telling other stories. There was just Swami. During those years, his classes were astonishing. They were astonishingly brilliant and deep and subtle and humorous and long. He would speak for hours, and we were enraptured. It was like nobody moved. I remember those years, and I think that I had some of my deepest spiritual moments in his presence in those classes. I mean, I remember not breathing. I was just so wrapped in what he was saying and how he was saying it. And it was as though the meaning of what he was saying was not passing through my brain. It was entering just directly. And I knew at the time that I would always remember what he was saying, even though I wasn't remembering it, actually. Often afterwards I'd write notes down, or during the class I'd sit and write notes, but it really wasn't necessary because there was this transmission, there was this osmosis that was happening with Swami and with everybody who was with him at that time. It was at that time that he wrote the book Raja Yoga, which when he wrote it was called 14 Steps to Higher Awareness, and there were 14 lessons. And it was at that time, a magnum opus. It was a great work that he had done. And to this day, I feel that Raja Yoga is his most brilliant work. I know the Bhagavad Gita is fantastic, and Patanjali is astonishing, and his commentaries on the teachings of Jesus, I love them all. But Raja Yoga is the Bible. Everything about the path to self-realization is in that book. And during that time also, his talks were being recorded, and those brilliant classes were made available. And there's very few people, I think, in the world who take advantage of those classes. They were published as the Raja Yoga audio supplement. I don't know what it's called now. But there are 14 talks, audio talks. They are available. And if you don't know about them, or if you don't have them, I really encourage you to get them and listen to them, because that was quintessential Swami at that phase of his life, the really brilliant teacher. His Sunday services were inspiring, and again, they were long, and his Kriya initiations were marvelous. Those of you who are Kriya Bandhs, his talks from those Kriya initiations are available. What I've done is I've loaded them all onto my iPod, and often when I go out running, I just listen to one after another of his Kriya initiations. They are so inspired and so brilliant. So this was the first phase when he had to take it upon himself as our elder spiritual brother, which is how he always considered himself. Not our teacher, certainly not our guru, but just an older brother, who had been born a little sooner than we had and happened to have been with the master. And so he taught us. He taught us everything. I would go with him when he left the community to teach in outlying areas. He taught in the college town, college city, not too far away, Davis University. And he invited me, I would accompany him. And I was it seems like hundreds of classes that he taught on the Hong Saw technique, the energization exercises. They were always different. They were always the same technique, presented in ever new ways, depending upon who was there in the audience. He would speak for an hour and a half, talking about the benefits of meditation, of how our lives could be improved in daily life, and then he would give the technique. So it was a big moment for us. Interestingly, none of the public areas were touched. The meditation retreat was not burned. The school was not burned. The publication building was not burned. But everybody, almost everybody, lost everything personal. So it was a huge test. Would we stay? The community was burned. It didn't look like the place that we had come to. And many people did leave at that time, but most of the people stayed. And thanks to Swami, he was able to help us, to teach us how to face tragedy and calamity with the right spirit as a test from God that has come to make us stronger. So he had been at the moment writing his autobiography, The Path, and he was in Hawaii finishing it and editing it when the fire occurred. He immediately came back and began to gather the community and help us to lift our sights beyond the ashes and see beyond, to see the big picture, to see the long range. And even though that fire was the fault of the local government, Swami would not bring a legal action against the government to recover our losses. Everybody else around us who lost their property brought a legal action and were given enormous amounts of money. Ananda could have rebuilt itself quickly with money coming from such a legal action. But Swami said, no, this is our karma. This has come to us as a test. And we would fail the test if we put the blame on somebody else. It doesn't matter if one of their cars was responsible. That was just the instrument. I mean, God had to use something as the karmic instrument, and that was it. But that instrument was not at fault. So he helped us to fully accept that karmic test and turn it into a beautiful spiritual lesson. And yes, as you know, we rebuilt. We built better. It took a long time, but we grew in the process. But 1976, I think, was the beginning of the next phase in at least my life with Swami, because we needed to expand our activities. I mean, that's what Swami said. He said, we've been building this community for the last 7 years. It's time for us now to go out and share what we have. Well, we didn't have anything on the physical plane. As I said, it was all in ashes. But we had the spirit that was rebuilding that community. And nobody could take that away from us. So in the second phase, it was the phase of expansion, of reaching out and sharing. And Swami began to go out on tours. And that was the phase in which we did the joy tours. You know, Swami never did anything alone, even though he could have easily, but he always brought people with him. You know, no matter what he did, like when he went out to teach Hong Sa class, he brought a car full of people. So he wanted to do a tour and talk about, we call them the joy tours. He wanted to talk about joy, how it's possible in the face of all circumstances in life to feel God's joy, to feel and see everything as a blessing. So we did a tour with Swami and 14 people. He got a motor home, a large one, and we bought 2 vans, and 14 of us went out on this tour that took us all across the country and even into Canada. We went from California in the north, south, down through Texas, across the southern part of the states, up the East Coast, stopping, I think I think it was 40 cities where we gave programs. And all the way up through Washington, D.C. and New York and up into Boston and then up into Montreal and then down again into Chicago and then Denver. It was a huge tour. Swami, whenever something happened and our spirits would get low, like the fire, he just, what do you say, lifted the bar. You know, like for high jumpers, well, okay, you can jump 2 meters, let's try 2 meters 6, and now let's try 3 meters. So we went from the fire pretty much directly into a 40-city, 3-month tour. And it was amazing. And many people came as a result. And then he went out on another tour. I mean, not even a few months later, I think 6 months after, he went on a second joy tour. And in this way, he was doing what Master had done on his spiritual campaigns, traveling. Yogananda traveled all across the country, drawing to him his own children. So between the period of 1976 for about 4 years, Swami was doing these tours. He also developed during that time a way to, how can I say, a hub around which all of our teachings could be placed. He was looking for the central teaching, and he found that in what he called superconscious living. So he went out and did yet another tour, not all around the country, a smaller tour called the Superconscious Living Tour. And it was at that time he developed the Superconscious Living exercises, the affirmations, and many other things. But he said that all of our teachings deal with raising our consciousness to that level at which we have perspective. We are seeing things from the top of the mountain and not from the basement of subconsciousness. So at that moment, we had something to tie together all of our teachings. After those tours, people began to flood in to the community. And the community, those of us living there, became worried. How can we integrate all of these people? We had that Kali Yuga thinking, there's a limit. The local government tells us that we cannot have more than 100 people on this land. And, we were going from 60 to 80 to 90. And we were saying, Swami, we have to close the doors. And he was saying, of course we don't. But the government says we do. No, we don't. He said something else will happen. Well, the third phase began, and that something else that happened was establishing the colonies. So from 1980 on, Swami sent people out, and we began to establish colonies. The first one was close by Ananda, in the capital of California, called Sacramento. The next one was in San Francisco. Swami himself spent a lot of time in the San Francisco Center. He placed Jyotishan Devi there and many other people. It was not small. Swami never started anything small. It was a huge house. I think there was, were you in the house? How many people? 20?
30 maximum.
Okay. Okay, 30 people were living in the house. Most of them doubled and tripled up. And so the colonies started. After that, there was Seattle, and then there was Portland. And so there was this explosion of joy, explosion of Ananda. At that conference that I mentioned before, when Swami was saying, I don't really care about communities, we went for a long walk, because after saying that, he talked about communities and Yogananda's vision, saying that they would expand over the whole globe. And at that time, I was very happy at Ananda Village. I mean, you know, it was my home, I loved it. Was beginning to figure things out, and here was Swami talking about expanding and going out and starting colonies and centers and so forth. And I was scared. You know how it is, you get secure, and then you say, okay, I'm happy here, let's shut the doors, we don't want anybody else. What Yogananda called the us for and no more consciousness that so many families have, you know, husband, wife, 2 children, and, you know, we have our little castle or fortress and we don't want to let anybody in. Well, so I was kind of in that mode at the time. And I was saying, Swami, you're not going to send us out, are you? And he looked at me with such compassion. He said, don't worry, Shivani, no. Not going to send you anywhere right now. He said, this is the moment when Ananda needs to look inward, and a moment will come when there will be an explosion, but that time isn't yet. Well, when the time came, and here we are. So it came in that 3rd phase. It came in the 1980s. Now, you know, Swami himself gave complete freedom to people. So he didn't tell them, you know, exactly what to do and so forth. He would just say, develop a community. You know, I'm sure Diana has told you about all of the very few instructions he gave her. I remember it was a little before that time. It was in the early 1980s when Swami had asked me to take over the management of the publications business. And I had no experience and no inclination and certainly no desire to do so. And I said to him, sir, I'm not qualified to do this. What do you want me to do? He said, oh, sell my books. And I said, well, how do you want me to do that? He said, well, you'll figure it out. And for the next 4 years, I tried to coordinate the activities, and he never gave me any other advice. That was it. That's all he said to me, sell my books. Not very long after that, he sent Diana and a few other people. Yes, exactly. The next phase, which I call the 4th phase, is expansion beyond the seas. It was the overseas development. And the first stop of that development was Europe and Italy. And so Diana and a very few other people, Keshava, right? Keshava was in the first wave. Diana and Keshava and a few others were sent to Italy with very few instructions, as I recall. What was it? Practice Kriya and learn Italian was kind of the summary of it. And now she's practicing Kriya and learning Hindi. So the themes repeat. And so in about 1983, the expansion of the colony, first it was the fire, the tours, the colonies and centers, and then overseas. There was Europe. And I arrived in Europe in 1985. And so Swami spent time with us in Italy. He would come over twice a year in the early years and spend a month or 2 or sometimes 3 because we really needed his presence in order to get it started. And then in 1996, we had built the Temple of Light and invited Swami to come over and dedicate that temple. And when he saw it, he was not only pleased, but in a way very inspired, because the architecture of that building reflected what he had seen and wanted to build in India during the years he had been here with SRF. And at the time when he was there, close to the inauguration, 2 of the residents Italian residents said to him, Swami, you've been living all this time in California. Why don't you come and live here in Italy. And right then, right at the lunch table, he just stopped for a moment and kind of looked up to Divine Mother, and he said, "All right, I will." And that was it. In that moment, he moved his residence from California, from World Brotherhood Village, this was 1996, to Italy. And he was very active in the growth of the work there, not in the day-to-day things. He was never involved in that. He always worked through other people. But in spreading the work, in going out and meeting people, Swami traveled the length and breadth of Italy. He gave programs and satsangs and conferences and retreats, and not just in Italy, but other countries. We went to Germany and to Switzerland. And he was tireless in going out and reaching out to meet people and then drawing them to the hub, into the center. And so he was there between 1996 and 2003 when he received the inspiration from Master to come here to India. So this is what I call the fifth phase. And in his years here, the 10 years, 2003 to 2013, it's the time of Swami's life that I call the Bliss Phase. When he was in Italy, it was hard, because the Italian people have a very curious mind and a very good intuition and a lot of artistic creativity, and they were able to understand who Swami is. He didn't have to explain himself. He could just speak and they would understand, and they would take it in. They could feel him, they know him. And he loved being there, loved being with the Italian people. He felt very, very much at home. And then Master sent him here in the fifth phase of his life with Ananda. And it was all bliss. During that time, Swami wasn't teaching anymore. He wasn't giving Kriya. Other people were giving Kriya. Did Swami give Kriya here? I don't think so. So by then he had given the blessing and the spiritual authority to other people to give the Kriya initiation and to teach. So he wasn't teaching. He wasn't giving Kriya. Of course, he continued to write. But it was satsang. It was all about satsang, of just him being with God and Divine Mother and letting that flow through him and giving us all the chance to be with him when he was in that state of joy. I think that the bliss phase began at a moment when he was in Florence, Italy. And I can't remember if he was living already in India, I believe so, in visiting Italy. But he went to Florence, which he often did. He was in a hotel and he had this vision. He had this experience, which he told us about right afterwards. And that was the vision where he saw all of humanity and he felt his connection with every person in the great ocean of God's love. And he actually experienced God's love for every one of his creatures. And that was a very important moment. It was an epiphany in Swami's life. And from that time on, he was just living in the bliss of God's love for everyone. From that time, every person he saw as a friend. He saw as a brother, as somebody he knew from the past, of somebody he had always been with, of somebody he loved in God's love. And so that was in those years And these are the years that you spent with Swami, which we could say were the best years of his life. And you're so fortunate to have been able to be with him in his bliss bhav. And now we've entered the 6th phase of our relationship with Swami, because only his physical body is gone, but his bliss and Master's work, which he came to move forward, continues. And it continues through us. It continues in a very powerful way through the movie Finding Happiness, which in a way is his final darshan and his final message to us. At the end of the movie, have many of you seen the movie already? Who's seen Finding Happiness? Raise your hand. Almost everyone. You may remember that at the end of the movie, the journalist, Juliet, asks Swami, "Do you have a final message for my readers?" And Swami says, "Yes. Don't live to be unhappy, live to be happy." And he talks about that briefly, and that's why the movie came to be called Finding Happiness. It was not intended to have that theme. It was supposed to be about communities. But when Swami speaks, he would just speak from inspiration. And when he was on camera, that's what he was talking about. That's the message he gave. And so he looks right into the camera and he says, "Live to be happy." And then he says, "And one more thing, please tell them this, give them my love." And that's the last thing he says in the movie. Live to be happy and give them my love. And then he blesses Juliet. And that beautiful scene where we feel that he's giving his love through that blessing to every one of us. So we're in phase 6 of Swami's continuing life. And now we're the instruments for continuing Master's work. And we're the instruments for that bliss. And we are the instruments for the happiness. And whether it's through this movie, which is giving all of us an opportunity to be part of Swami's continuing life, and in all of the other things that you're doing here, Swami's life continues. And it will go on and on and on with those messages and so many more. So let's take to heart the final messages he has given us. Let us live always to be happy. And let us become instruments for Swami's love to all souls. We stand.